I first discovered Lavender Grove on a sweltering July afternoon. Driving into the neighborhood, I noticed the sweeping rows of neat townhouses, each with carefully trimmed shrubs and identical mailboxes. Unlike the sprawling suburban lawns I'd known in my youth, Lavender Grove felt more like a gated village. Close together, uniform in style, but with an undeniable warmth emanating from the bright, flower-filled front gardens. A brilliant sign near the entrance read, "Lavender Grove, a community of harmony," accompanied by a stone sculpture of lilacs and lavender blossoms. The real estate agent had gone on and on about the perks: a well-maintained pool and tennis court, an HOA that ensured property values stayed high, and a sense of neighborly pride unmatched in typical suburban sprawl. I was admittedly drawn to the serenity suggested by the place. A uniform look, I figured, might also mean fewer disputes. How naive that assumption would prove. On the day I moved in, friendly neighbors introduced themselves with warm smiles. Retired couples walked small dogs along the sidewalks, and a few kids chalked hopscotch squares on a communal walkway. People waved at me from across the street as I unloaded boxes. It all felt reassuringly normal. Until, that is, I learned about the local figure they called Karen. People spoke the nickname in hushed tones or with ironic laughs. "You'll see," one neighbor said cryptically, giving me a wry smile. At the time, I shrugged it off. After all, every neighborhood has its quirks. How bad could one meddlesome board member be? My first few weeks in Lavender Grove passed smoothly. I settled into my new townhouse, discovered the local coffee shop, and started forming casual friendships with a handful of neighbors. But one person in particular struck me as especially warm and genuine. Agnes "Aggie" Tucker, a 74-year-old widow who lived just 2 doors down. Agnes had a kind, expressive face and silver hair always tied in a loose bun. She spent many of her afternoons out on her porch, reading or knitting, greeting anyone who walked by. We quickly bonded over small talk. She'd ask how I liked the place. I'd inquire about her crocheting projects. Over time, I learned that she was originally from a large Midwestern family and had married into a multicultural household. She'd lived in Lavender Grove for nearly a decade and loved to cook hearty meals, soups, roasts, casseroles, passing on the flavors she'd perfected over decades to her children and grandchildren when they visited. "I have this old pot passed down from my grandmother," Agnes explained once, beaming with pride. "Makes the best bone broth. Some nights, I'll leave it simmering for hours. The fragrance fills my little kitchen, reminds me of holidays growing up." Though I hadn't tasted her cooking yet, I could imagine the mouth-watering aromas. Occasionally, as I walked by her porch in the late afternoon, I'd catch a whiff of rich chicken soup or maybe a slow-cooked chili. It smelled divine to me, like home, warmth, tradition. But not everyone, I would soon discover, shared that sentiment. I still remember the first time I laid eyes on Marjorie Bloomfield, the woman whom many in Lavender Grove mockingly referred to as Karen. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in pressed capri pants and a neat blouse, her hair styled in a precise, chin-length bob. She stood near the mailbox cluster with a leather-bound binder tucked under one arm, scanning the street like a warden surveying her domain. Upon spotting me, she gave a curt nod. "You're new here?" she asked in a tone that implied she already knew the answer. I introduced myself politely, but Marjorie's expression remained impassive. She rattled off a few remarks about the HOA guidelines, where to park if I had visitors, the times for trash pickup, how tall the lawn could be before incurring a fine. The speed with which she recited these details hinted at an almost obsessive familiarity with the rules. "I'm the head of our Community Standards Committee," she announced, flipping open her binder to reveal color-coded tabs. "I ensure that everyone adheres to the established regulations so we can protect property values. If you need clarification on any bylaw, come to me." Her voice was clipped, efficient, condescending. Though she didn't explicitly mention her nickname, I knew from the neighborhood chatter that this was Karen, the figure who, some alleged, had once left threatening notes about a child's tree swing that violated aesthetic uniformity. I nodded politely, inwardly hoping I'd stay off her radar. Conflict was the last thing I wanted. But Karen, Marjorie, seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense potential battles. On that first day, she offered me a chilling smile. "Just keep everything neat, and we'll get along famously," she said, before strutting away in search of her next target. Life resumed in Lavender Grove, but every so often, I saw glimpses of Karen's meddling. One day, she confronted a neighbor about a wind chime, too loud for the designated quiet hours. Another time, I overheard her berating a teen for parking a bicycle near the communal mailbox, a tripping hazard, she insisted. Then came the day Agnes confided in me that she'd been receiving letters, stern notices on HOA letterhead, complaining about unpleasant cooking odors emanating from her unit. The letters cited a vaguely worded rule about nuisances that interfere with the peaceful enjoyment of others. Agnes was distraught. She'd never received complaints before, and she prided herself on being considerate. "I don't understand," she told me one morning, wringing her hands. "Plenty of folks here grill in their backyards. I only cook indoors. Yes, I simmer soup sometimes, but is that a crime?" Her face pinched with worry. "Do you ever smell anything off-putting?" I assured her I didn't. In fact, many neighbors had commented favorably on the mouth-watering scents wafting from Agnes's window. Yet the letters continued. One threatened a fine if the disturbance persisted. Agnes was perplexed, uncertain how to respond. She tried opening windows less frequently and keeping lids on pots. But as a widow who cherished cooking as her main hobby, she felt distressed that her daily routine might be under siege. Of course, we all suspected who was behind these letters. Though they were signed by the Community Standards Committee, that was effectively Marjorie Bloomfield's personal realm. Why was Karen so fixated on Agnes's cooking? Did she truly believe the aroma of homemade broth or stew was a nuisance, or was she simply on a power trip? Most neighbors sympathized with Agnes. "She's not cooking anything offensive," Ms. Carruthers, a retired teacher living across the street, remarked. "All I smell is the occasional whiff of chicken soup." People told Agnes to ignore the letters, but she worried that ignoring them might escalate the situation. Little did she know how far Karen was prepared to go. As the weeks passed, Agnes continued to receive letters about strong cooking odors. Her stress was palpable. At times, she'd skip her usual soup or stew, opting for quick microwaved meals to reduce the scent. It was heartbreaking, given that cooking was her passion. One particularly chilly autumn evening, I was returning from work around 10 p.m. The night sky was clear, and the neighborhood streetlights illuminated the sidewalks in a gentle glow. While passing Agnes's unit, I caught a faint aroma, perhaps a bean soup or a mild curry simmering. It smelled comforting in the crisp air. Just as I reached my own door, I noticed a figure lingering near Agnes's front porch. The silhouette was distinct, a woman with a bob cut, wearing a neat jacket, standing suspiciously close to Agnes's doorstep. There was no mistaking it. Karen. Curious and slightly alarmed, I kept my lights off and watched from my window. Karen crouched, as though inspecting something on the ground. Then she moved away, her posture tense, glancing left and right. She seemed to whisper something under her breath. I couldn't see precisely what she was doing, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Eventually, Karen left. I considered warning Agnes, but hesitated, uncertain if I was overreacting. After all, Karen could have been slipping another letter under the door or checking for a doormat violation, typical petty behavior. Nonetheless, a prickle of apprehension remained. Something about Karen's stealthy manner that night felt more sinister than usual. Early the next morning, I was awakened by a startled cry. It came from outside, near Agnes's unit. Heart pounding, I rushed out, still in my pajamas, to see what had happened. Agnes stood on her porch, her expression a mix of shock and fear. At her feet lay a greasy, congealed mess, a splatter of thick, murky substance streaking across her welcome mat and dripping down the front step. The smell was jarring, rancid cooking oil or grease. It was so slick that Agnes, stepping out in her slippers, had nearly slipped and fallen. A few neighbors converged, equally alarmed. Ms. Carruthers gasped. Another neighbor, Mr. Kim, bent down to examine the residue. The sight was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately dumped used cooking grease on Agnes's doorstep. It formed a grotesque puddle that could easily cause a dangerous fall. Agnes looked bewildered, close to tears. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Is this because my food?" Who would? But we all knew. That late-night observation of Karen lurking around the porch flashed in my mind. I helped Agnes steady herself, and Mr. Kim fetched a bucket of warm, soapy water from his place. Within minutes, we were scrubbing, trying to remove the foul grease before it set in or dripped further into the walkway. The entire time, Agnes trembled. "I'm too old for these pranks," she said, voice wavering. What if I'd slipped and broken a hip? A cold fury built inside me. If Karen had indeed done this, and I had little doubt, she'd crossed a line from petty harassment into outright endangerment. This was no mere letter or fine. This was an attack, a deliberate attempt to intimidate or punish Agnes for an alleged smelly food problem. We had to do something. But how to prove it? Karen was sly, often leaving no direct evidence. As we finished cleaning the porch, Ms. Carruthers placed a comforting hand on Agnes's shoulder. "We're not going to let this slide," she promised. "You deserve better than this." Agnes nodded, tears welling in her eyes, though she still appeared more baffled than vengeful. News of the grease dumping spread through Lavender Grove quickly. By midday, nearly everyone in our close-knit community was talking about it. People exchanged theories, outraged that someone would target a kindly senior citizen. A small group of neighbors formed a sort of informal watch, vowing to keep an eye on Agnes's porch in case there were more acts of vandalism. Some confronted Karen outright, though she denied everything, feigning shock that anyone would do such a nasty thing. "I might not like pungent cooking smells," she said in her clipped manner, "but I would never resort to something that childish." Her tone dripped with disingenuousness. She tried to shift suspicion. Perhaps some animal got into the trash and spilled grease? The neighbors who'd seen the neat, deliberate puddle knew better. This was no accident. When I recounted that I had spotted Karen lurking on Agnes's porch the previous night, her face turned crimson. She stammered a vague explanation about checking for potential trip hazards. No one believed her, but lacking hard proof, we couldn't simply accuse her of wrongdoing in a legal sense. The frustration was palpable. Agnes, meanwhile, was shaken. For the next few days, she kept her windows closed, hesitant to cook her beloved meals. She confided that her kids, who lived in another state, were urging her to move closer to them. "But I love this home," she said sadly. "My friends are here." She didn't want to uproot her entire life just because of one vindictive neighbor. A wave of empathy swept through our community, and a quiet anger simmered. If Karen wanted to spark fear, she'd miscalculated. Instead, people rallied around Agnes, determined not to let the older woman feel isolated. The question remained, how to stop Karen from escalating further? Lavender Grove was not a place where big controversies typically erupted. Prior to Karen's power grab on the HOA committee, we'd been a fairly harmonious community. Sure, there were occasional minor disputes over landscaping or noise, but rarely anything malicious. Now, forced to confront the possibility of intimidation within our midst, neighbors began stepping up. 1. Daily check-ins. A group of 4 or 5 residents organized a rotation to knock on Agnes's door daily, just to see how she was doing. Some brought groceries, others offered a cup of tea. These small acts of kindness reassured Agnes that she wasn't alone. 2. Porch cameras. Mr. Kim installed a simple motion sensor camera aimed toward Agnes's front steps. He'd recently upgraded his own home security system and had a spare camera. While it wasn't an impenetrable shield, it provided some peace of mind that if anything else happened, we might catch footage. 3. Rallying against intimidation. Several outspoken neighbors started a petition to request a formal HOA hearing regarding the harassment. Even though we lacked concrete proof that Karen was the culprit, the petition demanded the board address the pattern of targeted hostility toward Agnes. If enough people signed, the board would be compelled to hold a session. Karen, of course, caught wind of these developments. She remained outwardly calm, but occasionally fired off memos about privacy concerns with cameras in communal areas. Her typical refrain, "We must maintain uniform standards. No unapproved devices pointing at common walkways." She threatened fines if a camera was found to violate some bylaw. The rest of the board seemed reluctant to back her up, perhaps sensing how unpopular she'd become. Even so, Karen refused to apologize or back down. She continued to deliver her usual brand of official-looking letters to people about minor infractions, overgrown shrubs, unauthorized holiday wreaths, you name it. However, the old climate of fear had largely evaporated. People no longer cowered, emboldened by the sense of community. Where once neighbors might have quietly complied, now they banded together, questioning her every move. During this period of tension, Another idea took shape among a circle of concerned neighbors, a practical solution to the alleged odor problem. Even though we believed Karen's complaints were grossly exaggerated and her grease attack was indefensible, we realized that alleviating the cooking smells might at least remove her ostensible reason for harassing Agnes. Besides, it might truly improve Agnes's day-to-day environment. Several of us pooled funds to purchase a high-quality range hood for Agnes's kitchen. We researched models that had strong ventilation, capable of sucking away steam and odors, along with carbon filters. A small group of handy neighbors volunteered to help install it. One had experience in light HVAC work. We also picked up sets of sealed glass containers for storing food, in case that helped reduce lingering aromas. When we arrived at Agnes's house one Saturday, carrying the brand-new range hood and gift-wrapped containers, she was speechless. She clasped her hands together, tears of gratitude in her eyes. I don't know what to say. This is so generous. But you all didn't have to do this. We want you to keep cooking, Ms. Carruthers said. We love the smell of your meals. But maybe this will help with some of that steam, so nobody can complain. The nobody was obviously Karen, though we didn't speak her name. It took a couple of hours to uninstall Agnes's old hood and secure the new one in place. Ms. Carruthers cleaned the area. Mr. Kim handled the wiring. By the end of the afternoon, Agnes's modest kitchen had a gleaming modern ventilation system that whirred quietly yet powerfully. We tested it with a simmering pot of water. Sure enough, it sucked up the steam, venting it outside more efficiently. It felt good to do something constructive rather than stewing in anger. For Agnes, this was more than just an appliance. It was a tangible sign of the neighborhood's support. Later that night, she sent a group text. Thank you all for the kindness. I made a small pot of tomato soup, and I think the new hood is working great. I can't smell it in the living room anymore. I'm beyond grateful. The next big milestone came in the form of a special HOA meeting called in response to the petition. The board scheduled it for a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse, an unassuming building near the pool, typically used for potlucks or birthday gatherings. This time, though, tension filled the air as a crowd gathered, more residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA function. The official topic, addressing harassment and ensuring resident safety. Though not explicitly naming Karen, it was obvious what the impetus was. On the makeshift dais sat the HOA president, the treasurer, and Karen in her role as head of the Community Standards Committee. Other board members flanked them. Agnes sat in the front row, her posture tense but dignified. The president opened the floor to statements. Ms. Carruthers was the first to speak, condemning the grease incident, stating how it endangered Agnes's safety. Several neighbors shared stories of Karen's intimidation tactics, from threatening letters about trivial violations to suspicious late-night prowling. I described seeing Karen lurking near Agnes's door on the night in question. Karen, fuming, tried to maintain composure. These allegations are unfounded, she asserted, flipping through her binder. I've done nothing outside my duties, only enforcing our community standards. As for the grease, I have no connection to that. It's unfortunate, yes, but let's not point fingers without proof. She then brandished a handful of complaint forms about strong odors, claiming multiple residents had lodged concerns about Agnes's cooking. An immediate hush fell. The crowd looked around, eyes searching for any multiple residents who had actually complained. One man stood up. I made a single note about strong garlic smell months ago, but it was hardly a formal complaint. Didn't ask for any action. You took that out of context. Another neighbor shook her head. I never complained about Ms. Tucker's cooking. I said I smelled soup once, and it smelled good. The tide of opinion in the room was overwhelmingly in Agnes's favor. The meeting stretched on, with the board promising a deeper investigation. At one point, the HOA president, looking weary, made an announcement. Regardless of who is behind the grease incident, such an act is reprehensible. If any evidence links an HOA official to vandalism or endangerment, we will take swift disciplinary measures. A wave of applause followed. Karen's face was stone. The president added, we also caution all residents to respect each other's lifestyles. Cooking odors alone do not constitute a nuisance unless it's proven overwhelming or harmful. In short, Karen got no official punishment that night. No confession, no immediate resignation, but her power was diminished. The board had effectively undercut her premise for harassing Agnes. The message was loud and clear. The community condemned her tactics, even if they lacked ironclad evidence for criminal charges. With the new range hood installed and the community rallying behind her, Agnes found a renewed sense of joy in her kitchen. After that tense HOA meeting, she decided to go a step further, investing in an advanced ventilation system with better insulation and an upgraded air filter. Though the range hood had made a difference, she wanted maximum peace of mind, ensuring minimal scent escape. The problem was cost. Agnes lived on a modest pension, but to the surprise of many, the HOA announced it would cover a portion of her upgrade, an unorthodox decision, presumably to quell the conflict. Officially, it was framed as a community improvement for any resident with concerns about cooking odors. But behind the scenes, we learned that a small fine had indeed been assessed against Karen under the board's discretion for endangering a resident's safety. Though details were kept private, the rumor was that Karen chose not to challenge it, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. Agnes thus received partial financial relief, ironically funded by the very person who tormented her. She selected a local HVAC contractor recommended by Mr. Kim and scheduled the work. Over the span of 2 days, workers installed improved ductwork, a high-efficiency exhaust fan, and better insulation around her kitchen walls. The result? A minimal aroma escaping beyond her immediate space. When the system was done, Agnes invited a few of us for a celebratory lunch, her first big cooking session since the fiasco. She made a hearty chicken stew, letting it simmer to perfection. The air in her house smelled delicious, but the moment we stepped onto her porch, we realized how effective the upgrades were. The aroma was faint, barely perceptible outside. Agnes smiled, relieved. I can cook to my heart's content, and no one can claim I'm polluting their air. Though Karen hadn't confessed or faced full legal consequences for the grease incident, a sense of healing gradually took hold in Lavender Grove. People's daily routines began to return to normal. The tension that once surrounded Agnes dissolved. She was free to cook again without fear of another visit from Karen. The sense of solidarity that emerged from the crisis remained. Neighbors helped each other more openly, a shift from the polite but distant relations that can define suburban life. If Ms. Carruthers needed a ride to the pharmacy, someone stepped up. When Mr. Kim injured his foot, a rotating group of folks made sure his lawn stayed mowed. Lavender Grove, ironically, became the community of harmony promised by the sign at the entrance, though for reasons the marketing brochures never anticipated. Meanwhile, the board quietly re-examined its approach to handling alleged nuisances. They introduced a clearer procedure. Any formal complaint now required multiple signatories or verifiable evidence, not just a single letter from one disgruntled resident. They also clarified that household cooking aromas were not considered a violation unless extremely noxious or proven harmful, like chemical fumes. This prevented individuals like Karen from twisting vague bylaws to harass others. To Agnes's relief, the daily check-ins from neighbors tapered off as life settled. She no longer required that level of reassurance. Still, the friendships forged in that challenging period endured. She found herself invited to more social events, potlucks, and crocheting circles than ever before. In the weeks following the fiasco, the senior population in Lavender Grove, once quiet, became more vocal. Agnes's ordeal had been a wake-up call that quiet compliance might not always be the best response to petty tyranny. A group of older residents, some who rarely participated in HOA matters, began attending monthly meetings, wanting to ensure they had a say in new rules or revisions. Their presence tempered the once dominant voice of Karen, who found herself increasingly sidelined. At the same time, Karen's reputation took a hit. Some residents who'd previously admired her strict enforcement realized that her approach could devolve into bullying. Even among her few supporters, there was dismay at the idea that she might have stepped so far outside the bounds of decency. For her part, Karen stayed on the board but operated with far less swagger. She rarely brandished her binder of bylaws in public, presumably aware that eyes were on her. If she wrote complaint letters now, they arrived with a more measured tone, typically accompanied by the signatures of other board members or committees. It was a stark shift from her prior one-woman show. Agnes's cooking blossomed in a newfound freedom. No longer worried about retribution, she experimented with different cuisines, Indian lentil soups, Italian Sunday gravy, Cajun gumbo. Once in a while, neighbors teased her that she should open a small takeout business or a cooking blog. She'd laugh, insisting she was content feeding the folks who dropped by and, of course, her visiting grandkids. The simple upgrade of a ventilation system, combined with sealed containers, also improved Agnes's overall comfort. She no longer needed to open windows on chilly nights to vent steam. She found her utility bills dropping, thanks to the new insulation. In a bizarre twist of fate, Karen's destructive act indirectly led to upgrades that made Agnes's life easier, co-funded by the HOA fine levied against the culprit. Despite the calmer atmosphere, Karen never issued a direct apology. She kept up a facade that she'd been unjustly maligned. At times, she'd corner a neighbor, complaining about the fervor of the rumor mill. She insisted that people jumped to conclusions and that she was the real victim of a smear campaign. But few were sympathetic. The grease incident had left an indelible stain on her credibility. Occasionally, she'd lash out at small triggers, like a slightly overgrown planter or a doormat bearing a cheerful but unapproved design. The difference now was that if she pushed too far, multiple neighbors would stand up and question her authority. Gone was the era when Karen's dictates went unchallenged. The board, for the most part, supported the community's preference for a friendlier, less punitive approach. Karen's personal life also seemed affected. A rumor circulated that her adult children, who visited infrequently, had chided her for the negative attention she'd brought on herself. She became more reclusive, rarely lingering for chats, and seldom seen at block gatherings. Some neighbors tried to extend olive branches, inviting her to partake in events, but her pride seemed to keep her at arm's length. The trust she'd squandered might have been too fractured to repair without genuine remorse. For Agnes, the knowledge that Karen still lived nearby remained an uncomfortable reality. Even though she'd put the worst of the ordeal behind her, part of her worried that Karen might revert to extreme behavior. The presence of the porch camera, still in place, gave some reassurance. Yet life moved forward in Lavender Grove, and the shocking events of that autumn gradually receded into memory, replaced by a more positive collective spirit. Winter rolled into early spring, and with the changing season came a fresh wave of gatherings in Lavender Grove. On a bright Saturday morning, several neighbors organized a small outdoor culinary celebration in the shared courtyard, an informal potluck to showcase favorite dishes. Families set up folding tables and chairs, while kids darted around chasing a soccer ball. Agnes, of course, was the guest of honor. She prepared a robust beef barley stew and homemade biscuits. As the savory aroma rose from her crock pot, passers-by queued up eagerly for a taste. Nobody complained about the smell now. Instead, they savored it with appreciative sighs. Mr. Kim contributed stir-fried noodles, Ms. Carruthers baked her signature apple pie, and so on. The courtyard buzzed with laughter, shared stories, and the clinking of plastic utensils. Midway through, I noticed Karen standing off to the side, arms folded. She wore a guarded expression, as if uncertain whether she was welcome. In truth, she was free to join, but her own actions had created a chasm. Agnes, ever gracious, spotted her and offered a slight nod, but Karen merely pressed her lips together, then walked away. It was a microcosm of the distance that remained. Despite that brief, awkward moment, the potluck continued joyfully. Agnes glowed, delighted to see everyone enjoying her cooking. She told stories of her grandmother's recipes, how they'd comfort her on cold nights. The entire scene radiated the neighborly warmth that had drawn me to Lavender Grove in the first place. In the days that followed, I reflected on the events since my arrival, from quiet beginnings to the shocking grease incident, then the outpouring of solidarity that followed. Karen's attempt to suppress Agnes's culinary pastime had, ironically, led to an upgraded ventilation system, neighborly bonding, and a reaffirmation that Lavender Grove was truly a place where people cared for one another's well-being. The moral of Agnes's ordeal, it seemed, was that malicious behavior can never truly overshadow genuine community spirit, particularly when neighbors band together in empathy. Karen might never fully atone, but her destructive act ultimately backfired, strengthening the very tradition she'd tried to extinguish. And Agnes, though shaken initially, emerged more loved and supported than ever, continuing to fill her home, and, on potluck days, the entire courtyard, with the comforting sense of homemade meals.